On June 27th, 1988, the Hanshin Tigers did the unthinkable. They cut their best hitter. Randy Bass had been that for the last 5 years. The 1985 CL MVP had put up absolutely ridiculous numbers out of the number 3 spot in the lineup. Numbers that are just absolutely cartoonish. And he still holds the Hanshin Tigers record for batting average, on-base percentage, slugging, home runs, and OPS in a single season. While his slow speed meant he was never going to challenge for any kind of stolen base crown, the only other offensive records he doesn't hold are total bases and hits, held by the first Mr. Tigers, Fumio Fujimura, and RBI, which was also held by Fujimura until Makoto Imaoka broke that record in 2005. What made cutting Bass worse was the optics. He was cut because the team didn't want to pay for the surgery required to save Randy's son's life. They were contractually obligated to pay for that surgery. And they waited until he was in the US supervising his son's recovery to do it. This little chicken shit maneuver, unsurprisingly, backfired. Knowing that something like this might have happened, Bass had covered his ass. He'd recorded the meeting where the team had given him permission to leave and kept every receipt possible to make sure he wouldn't get screwed. And it cost the club dearly. But they still had to replace him. Nearly 35 years later, they're still trying. It's such a common occurrence for a new foreign player to be named the next Randy Bass that it's an in-joke among Hanshin Tigers fans. Given the progression of the skill level in NPB, MLB's embracing of analytics, and several other factors, it's more than likely that the Hanshin Tigers will never see a player of Bass's caliber again. But, like I said earlier, it hasn't stopped them from trying. So let's take a brief look at every foreign hitter who's joined the team from 1988 onward and see if any of them lived up to that legacy. I'll be giving each a grade from A to F. The first guy they went after was Rupert Jones. After a few years of being an all-star caliber player, mainly with the Mariners and Padres, Jones had been struggling and had been signed over from the AAA Oklahoma City 89ers. He's the reason the whole second coming of Randy Bass in-joke became a thing, as newspapers reported his signing with the headline, "The Return of Bass?" Fans naturally called BS. The Tigers decided to play this up by starting Jones at first base. Jones had only played 5 games at first base in his entire pro career up to that point, so he struggled, making several errors and generally playing below average defense, before moving back to the outfield and playing much better. On the offensive side of the ball, he was slightly above average. Not a great replacement for one of the best pure hitters in NPB history. He gets a C. After the failure that was the Jones experiment at first base, in 1989 the Tigers decided to go scouting for someone who, could actually play the position. Luckily for them, Cecil Fielder was stewing behind Fred McGriff on the Toronto Blue Jays and looked to establish himself as a legitimate talent. Given that this was bubble economy Japan, the Hanshin Tigers were actually able to pay him enough to lure him away from the MLB system. Fielder's lone NPB campaign was extraordinary. 38 bombs and a WRC plus of over 170. Fielder ended up being the lone bright spot in what was a terrible Hanshin Tigers offense, and it became pretty clear that there was no way he was sticking around. He would switch from one Tigers uniform to another and join the Detroit Tigers in 1990. Still, the Wild Bear is often included on the pantheon of Hanshin Tigers legends. He gets an A. In 1990, the Hanshin Tigers decided to go for someone with more NPB experience, poaching Larry Parrish away from the Tokyo Swallows. While he wasn't as good as he was during his time with the Swallows, he was still a pretty above-average player, hitting 28 home runs and putting up a 120 WRC+. He gets a B. The Tigers would sign 2 new foreign hitters for 1991. The first was Marvel Wynn, who didn't jive well with Japanese culture and was atrocious offensively. F. Fortunately, the other foreign hitter that joined the Tigers in 1991 was a much better player. Tom O'Malley spent 4 seasons as the heart of the Tigers' offense, putting up a .345 triple slash and always playing at 110%. His 20.8 WAR in a Tigers uniform is the second most of any foreign player after Bass. Sadly, barring 1992, the Tigers never sniffed the pennant during his stretch. Because this is the Tigers, they decided to trade him for cash when he was still at the peak of his abilities, and he would take home the 1995 CL MVP and a Japan Series ring with the Tokyo Swallows. Still, he gets an A. The guy who replaced Marvel Wynn for 1992 was NPB veteran Jim Paciorek, who the Tigers had lured over from Yokohama. He played alright in a Tigers uniform, putting up a 117 WRC+ and 29 homers in his 2 seasons with the club, just as NPB deadened the ball following the power-mad 80s. He gets a B. They replaced him with Rob Deere. Why the f did they think Rob Deere was a good idea? He gets an F. In 1995, the Tigers went with an all-new set of foreign players, Scott Coolbaugh and Glenn Davis. Davis was registered as just Glenn to distance himself from Dick Davis, who'd been arrested and deported for using marijuana in 1988. Never mind that they looked nothing alike, but whatever. Both Coolbaugh and Davis played decently in their first season, but Coolbaugh was injury-prone and Davis clashed with manager Taira Fujita. Both were cut in June of 1996 as the Tigers had gone into an absolute tailspin. Davis was blasted by the Osakan sports media as the worst foreign player in history. In reality, he was just above average. Both get a C. Replacing Coolbaugh and Davis midway through the 1996 season was Kevin Maas and Craig Worthington. Maas got figured out by Japanese pitchers almost immediately and was awful at the plate. The Tigers' Owen Dunn had originally chanted Bass's cheering song whenever Maas came up to the plate thanks to the similarities in their names. However, when it became clear that Maas was nowhere near the hitter Bass was, they stopped doing it. However, Maas played good enough defense to keep him above replacement level. Worthington was better, but suffered a muscle strain and missed the rest of the year. F for Maas, D for Worthington. Oh boy, 1997. Mike Greenwell will be discussed another day. F. After a solid season with the Chunichi Dragons, the Hanshin Tigers poached Darnell Coles and hoped that he could keep up production, or even improve in the more hitter-friendly confines of Koshan Stadium. He did not. 85 WRC+ in 60 games. F. Phil Hyatt had joined the team at the start of the year, but started slow and got sent to the knee gun in favor of Reed Seacrest. Reed Seacrest's OBP was higher than his slugging. That's not great. F. So when that experiment failed, he got called up again to finish the season with the club. He ended up being the best player out of the bunch, meaning that he was just below average. D. Funnily enough, Hyatt nearly got a second shot at NPB in 2003 when Hiroki Kokubo went down with injury, but the Hawks elected to sign Julio Zuleta instead. Zuleta had a very successful 6-year stint in NPB. Safe to say they made the right choice. In 1998, having not learned from the failed Darnell Coles experiment, the Tigers elected to go out and sign disgruntled Chunichi Dragons legend Alonzo Powell. This made sense on paper, as he'd gone on the record saying how much he hated hitting in the Nagoya Dome, and going from one of the least hitter-friendly parks in the league to the most hitter-friendly park in the league surely would give him a boost. Joining him was fringe big leaguer Dave Hanshin, who was looking for a fresh start. Neither played well. Hanshin was below average across the board, and while Powell did hit better, he ended up being injured and replaced by Desi Wilson. Desi Wilson had a negative WRC+. Yikes. C for Powell, D for Hanshin, F for Wilson. So, following those two disastrous years, it can't get much worse, right? In 1999, the Hanshin Tigers signed the Oracle, Mike Blowers, and Mark Johnson. While Blowers could only hang around replacement level and was cut mid-season, Johnson had a decent season, becoming the first foreign Tiger to put up a 20-homer campaign since 1995 and put up the highest OPS of any full-time Tiger that year. By all accounts, Johnson did everything right. He mingled well with his Japanese teammates, including a certain big boss, and he showed a willingness to learn from new manager Katsuya Nomura in order to better adapt to the Japanese game. By now you know how this goes. Yasuaki Taiho decided to have a second wind at 35 and really couldn't play anywhere but first base, so the Tigers elected to keep him instead of Johnson. This is despite the fact that Johnson was younger and Taiho really wanted to go back to the Dragons. Johnson would end up signing with the Mets, which helped them land Shinjo and typical. D for Blowers, B for Johnsama. After spitting in the face of the best foreign player they'd had in 5 years, the Tigers decided to replace him with Tony Tarasco and Howard Battle. Battle hit awfully to start the season and was put on the bench, where he played decently in a pinch hit role. But unless you're the 2021 Oryx Buffaloes, you don't waste a foreign roster spot on a pinch hitter. so they grabbed Micah Franklin from the Fighters in a trade, and he actually played pretty well. Small problem, advanced analytics didn't exist yet, and that 172 batting average was not on. Next, they brought in Jason Hardkey to finish the season, and he was awful offensively, but by then the Tigers didn't have a hope in hell of getting the pennant, so he was kept on for reasons of stability. Meanwhile, Tarasco did hit 19 home runs, but aside from that, he was nowhere near as good as Johnson, both offensively and defensively. Goose Egg War. F for Battle, F for Hardkey, D for Tarasco, and I guess an F for Franklin, even though it wasn't really his fault. So after that, for 2001, the Tigers wiped the slate clean and brought in Ivan Cruz and Eduardo Perez. Cruz had a promising start, as in the first game of the season he took Giants ace Darryl May deep to center. May had been a Tiger in 1998 and 1999, which really rubbed it in. But after that, he got figured out. He remained a giant killer though, with 7 of his 14 homers coming against the Kyojin, including 3 in one game, which would have been great except for the fact that Kazuhiro Kiyohara also hit 3 in a game that season, so His problem was a lingering shoulder injury that took him out for a long stretch in mid-season, which never really let him get his sea legs under him. Eduardo Perez, on the other hand, played awfully. His great defense wasn't worth the 76 WRC+. F. After Perez was cut, the Tigers brought in Tom Evans down the stretch. Evans also wasn't very good and had seemingly no pop in his bat, but he was kept on because the Tigers were, once again, out of contention. Still, F. Meanwhile, Cruz gets a D. The Tigers kept Tom Evans on for the next season, but they couldn't find a spot for him in the lineup, so they traded him to the Seibu Lions. He would only be the 4th best hitter on a Lions team that went all the way to the Japan Series, behind Alex Cabrera, Kaz Matsui, and Big Ben Wada, all 3 of whom I consider top 100 players. Oof. What made it worse is one of the guys that Wally pipped Evans in 2002 wasn't particularly great. Derek White put up extremely similar numbers at the dish, with a lower OBP and a higher slugging. Still, F. The other guy was worth it. After 2 solid seasons with the Oryx Blue Wave, the Tigers poached George Arias from their little brothers, and he immediately became the power piece they so desperately needed. He became the first foreign player since Cecil Fielder to hit 30 home runs in a season, and led the team in homers, extra base hits, and RBI. In 2003, he was even better, 38 homers, 107 RBI, and was the 2nd most valuable hitter on the team after Tomoaki Kanemoto. The Tigers made their first Japan Series since 1985, but suffered a heartbreaking defeat in 7 games to Sadaharu O's Fukuoka Hawks. Even nearly a quarter century after his playing days were over, O wasn't done tormenting Tigers fans. Arias continued to play well in 2004, even as Kanemoto became the undisputed face of the team. Still, 25 homers while playing through a back injury is worth noting, especially after the other foreign hitter they signed, Mike Kincaid, fell flat on his face. Kincaid gets an F. But this is the Tigers we're talking about. We're just waiting to see how they mess this up. Well, glad you asked. Tyrone Woods was unhappy in Yokohama and was looking to test out the free agent market. Surely Woods, Arias, Kanemoto, and Makoto Imaoka would take this team over the hump and they win their first Japan Series in 20 years. Oh wait, they dropped Arias to make room for Woods. And Woods signed with the Dragons instead. Still, Arias' 122 WRC Plus was the highest by any foreign hitter since Tom O'Malley. He firmly gets a B. In the scramble to replace the insulted Arias, they grabbed Shane Spencer from the Mets organization. However, the Tigers had finally learned that chucking minor leaguers into the fire was a recipe for disaster, and they elected to go with another guy with NPB experience, poaching Andy Sheets from the Hiroshima Carp. Small problem, Sheets was a shortstop, so they had to move him to first base.
It's not that hard, Scott. Tell him, Wash.
It's incredibly hard.
Small problem, Sheets' offensive production was great for a shortstop, but for a first baseman? Still, Sheets made up for his average hitting with elite defense, and the Tigers made it all the way to the Japan Series again, only to get the crap kicked out of them by Bobby Valentine's Chiba Marine. While Sheets started every game in that series, Spencer was relegated to being a bench bat, which would have been fine if not for the fact that the man they chose to DH instead, Atsushi Kataoka, was even worse. Spencer wouldn't last much longer either. He'd sprain his ankle getting out of his car at spring training, and the injury made his mech play even worse, leading to him getting cut at the end of the season. He gets a D. Sheets would be the only foreign hitter on the Tigers in 2007, but he slumped, and the Tigers ended up moving him around the diamond to at least use his defense to fill a need. He'd retire at the end of the season despite a couple offers from other teams, stating that, "I don't want to play for anyone but the Hanshin Tigers." The Tigers offered him a coaching position, but he turned it down because he wanted to go back to the States to raise his kids. He instead became the Tigers' chief American scout, a position he still holds to this day. Even though he was an average hitter, he did play over 400 games with the club, and thus I'm boosting what would be a C grade up to a B. After Sheets, the lone foreign hitter the Tigers signed in 2008 was Lou Ford. He hit terribly and lasted less than 50 games. F. In 2009, Kevin Mensch managed to play even worse. 15 games, 0 WRC+. How does that even happen? Much less twice. F. In an effort to get revenge for Tom Evans, the Tigers grabbed Craig Brazell from the Cebu Lions in 2009. While Brazell did help the Lions to a ring in 2008, he was far from the biggest concern in their lineup. And even though walking was a foreign concept to him, Brazell still had a decent offensive season with 16 homers at a 124 WRC+. So the Tigers kept him around for 2010, the same year they brought in a new outfielder on the direct advice of Andy Sheets. That guy was Matt Merton, and in 2010, they would both go off. Merton broke Ichiro's single-season hits record by hitting .214, winning a race with Nori Aoki, and to a lesser extent Tsuyoshi Nishioka, while playing elite defense. That .214 still stands as the Central League hits record. Meanwhile, Craig Brazell hit 47 home runs, second to only Alex Ramirez, whose CL hit record Matt Merton had broken. Both men get an A for this season alone. You'd think with that kind of production the Tigers would have made the Japan series, right? Nah, they got swept by the Giants in the first round thanks to a late game collapse in Game 2. Because Tigers. NPB would respond to this offensive explosion by severely deadening the ball for 2011, which drove Brazell's production way down, but it still wasn't bad by any means. Neither was his 2012 season, where he led the team in home runs with 12. Now, if you think the Tigers would keep their best power hitter, you haven't been paying attention. He signed with the Chiba Marines for 2013, and even though he only hit 11 home runs that season, it was still second on the team to Tadahito Iguchi. The man who replaced Brazell was Brooks Conrad. Brooks Conrad played less than 30 games in a Tigers uniform. F. In 2014, they would sign Mauro Gomez, and he'd immediately become their best hitter. Gomez and Merton dragged a Tigers team that was fairly mediocre offensively to the Japan series that year, barely edging out the Hiroshima Carp in the first round before sweeping the Giants in the CLCS. Sadly, they got exposed by the evil empire known as the Fukuoka Hawks in the Japan series. These two would take the Tigers to the playoffs again in 2015, but they'd lose in the first round to the Giants. Then, Merton decided to try and make an MLB comeback with the Cubs, leaving the Tigers with Mauro Gomez and no one else. They did try and grab Matt Haig to back up Gomez in 2016, but he was below average in his 31 games with the club. Still, good enough for a D. Gomez, on the other hand, gets a B. 2017 would see the Tigers sign Jason Rogers and Eric Campbell. Rogers was okay, but he spent 2/3 of the season injured and then he dipped right before the playoffs. And the less said about Eric Campbell, the better. D for Rogers, F for Campbell. In 2018, the Tigers signed Willen Rosario out of the KBO, only for him to become one of the worst foreign players in NPB history. F. Efren Navarro wasn't much better, but at least he could play defense. Still, F. And Yangervis Solarte hit one walk-off home run in 2019, but outside of that, he couldn't hit a beach ball. F. In 2020, the Tigers grabbed Justin Bohr, as well as another KBO star, Jerry Sands. Bohr had a very slow start, but eventually evolved into an average hitter. If not for the pandemic, he'd probably still be with the team, as he would have definitely improved. Jerry Sands, on the other hand, hit much better, which made up for his atrocious defense. He'd leave after the 2021 season. Bohr gets a C, Sands gets a B. That leaves the Tigers with two foreign hitters on their roster today, Jeffrey Marte, who's in his 4th season with the club, and Mo Rojas Jr., who's in his 2nd. I haven't ranked them because they're still active, and those rankings could be subject to change. So, let's go over the rankings. Marvel Wynn, Rob Deere, Kevin Mass, Darnell Coles, Mike Greenwell, Desi Wilson, Jason Hardkey, Howard Battle, Micah Franklin, Eduardo Perez, Tom Evans, Derek White, Mike Kincaid, Lou Ford, Kevin Mensch, Brooks Conrad, Eric Campbell, William Rosario, Efren Navarro, and Young Garvis Solarte get an F. He's gonna rake in Japan. Yeah, sure, buddy. Phil Hyatt, Dave Hansen, Mike Blowers, Tony Tarasco, Yvonne Cruz, Shane Spencer, Matt Haig, and Jason Rogers all get Ds. Rupert Jones, Scott Coolbog, Glenn Davis, Craig Worthington, Alonzo Powell, and Justin Bohr get Cs. Larry Parrish, Jim Pashurik, Mark Johnson, George Arias, Andy Sheets, Mauro Gomez, and Jerry Sands all get Bs. And finally, Cecil Fielder, Tom O'Malley, Craig Brazell, and Matt Merton get As. The sad part is, there have been foreign players of Bass's caliber who've entered NPB during this time. Alex Cabrera, Tuffy Rhodes, and Roberto Petahine all put up careers at or above Bass's caliber, and currently Neftali Soto and Tyler Austin are both fantastic hitters. And Alex Ramirez too, even if the back 3 years of his career dropped him off my top 100 rankings. There have been players of this caliber who have entered NPB in the last 25 years, but the Tigers haven't been able to get a single one of them. Sometimes that's just how it goes. But, hey, maybe that next Randy Bass is out there. And here's hoping Andy Sheets can find him. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what you see here, like, comment, and subscribe to feed the YouTube algorithm, and share it with anyone you think might be interested. Once again, thanks for watching. I've been Gaijin Baseball. Peace.